Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and this time we are returning to Trope Talk. And one of perhaps the most recognizable, I would argue, it is perhaps top three most recognizable tropes slash um, writing forms. I don't know. I kind of think of it as the typical archetypical, kind of similar to like the plot structure. The hero's journey, I feel like ties really well into that. Um, but perhaps top three trope of all time, the hero's journey. Um, Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. And please do go check out the gaming channel here on YouTube, where I upload old streams and dumb clips, yada yada yada. The hero's journey. I think this is most popularly uh seen through the lens of, you guys ready? Gotta make the reference every single trope talk. Luke Skywalker is, I think, the most easiest character to point to from the original trilogy. Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy as part of the hero's journey. Um, Others, Aang kind of does it. I don't know if Aang follows it as archetypically as Luke does. Really trying to remember. But yeah, let's go. I really got nothing else to add here. I'm curious exactly as to how they're gonna cover it, so I'm gonna prevent myself from yapping too much here at the beginning, and we're just gonna dive straight in.
Hey Red, you won't believe the morning I had.
What is hero definite threshold guardians, mentors, guides?
I just fought off an entire horde of ninjas. Red? Hey, look, someone's writing characters based on antiquated stereotypes rather than personal experience. Huh, guess she's not here after all. Where on earth is she? Huh, what's with all these notes conspicuously scattered on the floor? Oh, this better not be an apocalypse log. Oh, no, it's just trope notes. The hero's journey. Well, let's give it a shot. Can't hurt to try. So, the hero's journey as a codified concept was initially coined by Joseph Campbell in his 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. After examining a large number of stories and myths from various cultures around the world, Campbell analyzed the common threads he recognized and came to the conclusion that he had identified the fundamental components of the archetypal hero's journey. The idea is that this formula, this monomyth as he confidently calls it, covers everything from Gilgamesh and the Buddha all the way up to modern day and can be identified in a large number of stories in between.
And I'm sure it's going to be said here to blatantly put this umbrella over all these monomyth is wrong, right? If you really look at it as to how he says the hero's journey progresses, and then you actually look at some of these stories, you will see that, like, wait a minute, it doesn't actually follow this exactly, right? So again, to note, your hero's journey does not, as we've said before, your hero's journey does not have to follow things precisely. Actually, I thought I was gonna make a point here, but I am blanking on what I want to say next, so I'm just going to move on.
Now, while it's cool that so many different stories share common threads, which you may note is the definition of a trope in the first place, Campbell went a little overboard on trying to apply the rule to absolutely everything and assert that it was the only way hero stories can be told. But, of course, no trope is omnipotent, and it's impossible to come to one formula for how all stories since forever have been written. For our purposes, let's take a less cavalier approach. The hero's journey is not a trope that all stories do or should follow as a strict formula, but rather, the trope works best when it serves as a lens through which to view and analyze a story. Think of it as a more detailed version of a 3-act structure. There's no mandate that anyone has to write that way, but knowing about it and understanding how it works lets you analyze the story from this perspective, and potentially identify interesting story components you might have otherwise overlooked. And
okay, I think I see where he is going with this. Yes, it is essentially a tool for you as the reader to kind of get a semblance as to what to expect within a story, right? If you are we'll use Star Wars because it is an easy example. When you are watching Star Wars, you have a very because of all right, yeah, okay, this is actually a really good a good metaphor, simile, whatever. Um when Star Wars first released, when you first watched Star Wars for the first time, you and we'll use episode 4 as the starting point, right? The You're introduced to it and the reason why it uses a Luke Skywalker and the safe hero's journey, the typical what is seen trope as the hero's journey, is because it is the familiar, right? And then when we go to the prequels follow come after because that is twisting the journey that we saw Luke go on, right? It is taking us into the unfamiliar for a bit, right? Um, which is why I think George Lucas is a master of theme and trope. Um, it's just that once he gets to actually writing the details down, it's where he messes up. But anyways, what was I saying? Yeah, and so for the audience, it's like, okay, we know what to expect. Having expectations, and then the writer, like you as a writer, following the hero's journey, and you're like, I gotta. Everyone talks about twisting tropes. I gotta twist tropes. You don't have to twist tropes. You don't have to twist them. People, and honestly, I would say most people, probably the more popular thing to do is to not twist them, is to have people like to know what is coming next because life is chaotic, right? Yes, there are going to be things that you should probably perhaps still twist around and do and try and do differently in your story, and then but don't like twist like every single one. It's good to have certain tropes just like stay the same, stay as expected, which is why we're going to talk about Song of Ice and Fire real quick here. This is why my theory for Jon Snow is that he is following the stereotypical hero's journey, because what would be the greatest twist for George R. R. Martin to do? A man known for twisting tropes on their head, but then the ultimate twist is that he never twisted the hero's journey. I feel like that would be a genius ass move. I saw that online from someone. I can't remember where. I think I read it online in a forum somewhere. And when I read that, I was like, "Holy shit! You could be correct." And that is the theory I'm going with. That Jon Snow is following the stereotypical arc hero's journey. But anyways, I forget the point I was trying to make.
And also, like
Again.
all lenses, you need to make sure that you're not using it to view stuff that doesn't fit. Not all stories are hero's journeys, and in some
Yes.
cases, looking at a story through the lens of a hero's journey will obscure your view of the parts of the story.
Right, like you wouldn't look at. All right, so we're gonna use. You can look at Anakin Skywalker as a hero's journey because that I feel like that's part of the point, right? Anakin was to go down a hero's journey, but then fell from it. But like different characters within A Song of Ice and Fire, you wouldn't look at Arya as through the lens of a hero's journey. You wouldn't look at Cersei or Jaime through the hero's journey. That isn't their purpose as characters. You can look at I would say Daenerys and Jon Snow through the lens of a hero's journey, but I think they are the only ones. Right? Like you do the story and yourself a disservice by looking at characters through, right, that trying to put the lens of a hero's journey on certain characters, right?
That don't easily fall into its categories. Trope responsibly, kids. So before the hero's journey was the thing that all the cool heroes were allegedly doing, the term for the general leave the ordinary world to have an adventure myth was the medicine journey, a concept observed in worldwide examples of shamanism by University of Chicago professor Mircea Eliade, who wrote a few books on the subject. The medicine journey serves as the structural foundation of the hero's journey, with all the other bits basically added in by Campbell for specificity later. The basic structure of the medicine journey journey is the following. A problem exists for which there is no solution within our ordinary understanding of the world, like our starting culture. So, the protagonist must travel elsewhere to find the solution, and eventually they return with the solution to the problem. For instance, the journey to the West is a medicine journey where the problem is evil and suffering and the solution is enlightenment, the West being the elsewhere Tripitaka and friends have to travel to. So the hero's journey heavily reflects that original structure of leave, find solution, come back. So Campbell's trope takes the three-part structure of 1. Departure, where the hero leaves the familiar world, 2. Initiation, where the hero navigates the unfamiliar world, otherwise known as the world of adventure, and 3. Return, where the hero, well, returns to the familiar world, usually bringing along the stuff they went to the unfamiliar world for in the first place. Otherwise, you'd have a problem. Campbell's first major alteration to this trope was to install the hero archetype as the protagonist. The medicine journey could have any type of protagonist whatsoever with literally 0 caveats. It could be a group, a child,
Okay, so the medicine journey is the very broad one where it's like essentially everything fits in, right? It is very a simple kind of trope. The medicine journey is protagonist, problem, leave, return. Hero's journey. Protagonist is a hero specifically. Has certain tropes, right? So we get more narrow, I guess. With the
human monk with his 4 monster friends, you name it. By contrast,
we're analyzing the hero's journey a bit differently than I thought we would, but that is because we have blue here instead of red. I wonder if red will come back.
Hero is a much narrower characterization, and it comes with a decent amount of narrative baggage too, so we can already see how Campbell is starting to narrow it in here. From there, Campbell developed a highly specific and detailed model of the fundamental hero's journey, adding a large number of secondary story elements he observed frequently augmenting the general medicine journey structure. He was also using it to try and make sweeping assessments of humanity as a whole, which is never a good sign in literary analysis. The problem is that the trope as he outlined it was way too specific and didn't really apply to all that many things. So as a result, it isn't all that useful even as an analytical tool, unless you're willing to flagrantly abuse and squish around the text you're trying to analyze to fit it exactly. Which, please don't do that. It makes writers very sad. So since then, a lot of people have made their own versions of the model to the point where no two sources on it will fully agree with one another, stripping away a lot of the faff to make it.
I feel like, so when I think of the hero's journey, I think of essentially a lot of the similar things as the medicine journey, but one I think important thing when it comes to the hero's journey is, and we saw it here in the previous frame. Let's go back. Keep going back. Don't worry. Hold on. We'll get there eventually, maybe. Come on. How far back do I gotta go? Come on. We'll just nope. Here. The refusal of the call is I think supernatural aid is already tied into the medicine journey. I think it's essentially that's going to be there. But the refusal of the call, I think, is the most important part of what you would call a hero's journey. And then Master of Two Worlds. They leave somewhere and they become like a master of that place, and then they come back and they become a master of what they're returning to. Essentially, Luke Skywalker does that, right? He leaves and becomes essentially a master of the Force, and then he comes back and he becomes a master essentially of the wider galaxy, a legend. Slightly different, but still really it's essentially the same thing. Right? He becomes a master and then Aang follows this, right? The refusal of the call. He abandoned his and fled and ran and then hid with Appa, and then for 100 years was missing. And then by the end of the story, he is master of the spirit and the physical world. As the Avatar, he has mastered both sides of what it is to be the Avatar. So I think essentially hero's journey, same stages as the medicine journey. However, the two things that are added that make it a hero's journey is refusal of the call and then master of the two worlds, which the mastery of two worlds can take shape in many different ways. most usually the mastery of two worlds is um, shown through mastery of whatever magic system is within said universe, right? Aang masters the avatar state, etc. by the end. Um, and then he returns, right? Luke Skywalker masters the Force, and then he returns. He finishes his training and he returns and brings down the Emperor. Um, that that right there, I think, is what I would say makes something the hero's journey.
Trying to analyze to fit it exactly, which, please don't do that. It makes writers very sad. So since then, a lot of people have made their own versions of the model to the point where no two sources on it will fully agree with one another, stripping away a lot of the faff to make it more inclusive and more useful to understand. The general rule of thumb nowadays is that a lot of stories fit some of the components of the hero's journey, but it's meant to be flexible, and there shouldn't be pressure to force a story to fit it. Again, it's not a recipe, it's there to help us understand story structure. A lot of writers have serious beef with this trope when taken as mandate because their critics tell them—
Okay, one thing I think we can see here, the difference in how red and blue discuss tropes. Blue is giving us here really the look as what can we do as an audience, whereas red looks at it more so through the lens of a writer. Which I'm surprised by, because blue is also kind of a writer. He writes stories. He tells his history through a sort of narrative lens.
Their story needs to fit the hero's journey, which is as needlessly annoying as any "oh man, you gotta do this trope" complaint. So we gotta tread carefully. Okay, so with the origins and several disclaimers out of the way, here is the modern consensus of what approximately a hero's journey looks like. Stage 1 is the ordinary world. This is the hero's starting point. It's usually familiar to the audience and definitely familiar to the hero. The purpose of the ordinary world is—
that's why Luke Skywalker starts as a farm boy.
to give us a status quo to start from, and to get your audience personally invested in the comfort the ordinary world provides so the impact of leaving it is strengthened later on. As an optional bonus, your hero can be comfortable with their life here, but really yearning for something more, foreshadowing the inevitable onset of plot. Next, they get the call to adventure, where the hero learns that they might need to do something out of the ordinary in order to save their familiar world. This stage is sometimes accompanied by a mentor character, your Gandalfs and Obi-Wans, but sometimes they show up later to guide the hero through the unfamiliar world instead. This part is identifiable in the original medicine journey structure as the moment your protagonist realizes there's a problem that they can't solve internally. The next step, the refusal of the call, is where the hero doesn't want to go on an adventure and is narratively punished for this. Typically, their ordinary world is damaged in some way as a result of their
Aunt and uncle.
refusal to act, so the hero then recognizes that they need to go on the journey, even if it's still semi-reluctant. If you have a gruff but fair father figure in your ordinary world, the narrative punishment is usually this dude getting Uncle Ben. The refusal is actually semi-optional even in this structure, because sometimes heroes are all about adventure and jump at the opportunity instead. Again, it's flexible. Stage 4 is when the hero crosses the first threshold into the unfamiliar world, and the story really gets going. Here, the hero makes a conscious and irreversible decision to go on the adventure and crosses through some physical threshold that signifies that. Sometimes there are threshold guardians to test the hero, but that's optional. If you're dealing with something like urban fantasy where the natural world is the world of adventure, the first threshold is usually the moment where the hero gains the power to see the more adventurous underside of the ordinary world, or is introduced to the secret world and has the urban fantasy rules explained to them. In the next step, the realm of adventure, the hero learns how to navigate a world totally different from the ordinary world they started in. Sometimes this involves nifty loot, friends and allies, convenient mentors, etc. This is usually a very large portion of the story because it's fun, and that's what we're all here for. Also, sometimes this part of the story has the hero find or at least figure out the solution to the initial problem that they're here to solve, making the problem getting the solution back to the ordinary world. Okay, So, this next stage is often the most misunderstood. In a lot of cases, it's shoehorned in right before or even during the final fight with the big bad, which really doesn't do it justice. This section is usually called the Belly of the Whale, named after that very moment in the story of Jonah. It's where the hero descends into an abyss or, in one way or another, goes down and undergoes a psychological trial during their darkest hour. In the
Obi-Wan
classical
dies.
Greek and Roman tradition, this part of the story is known as the katabasis, literally going down, and usually constitutes a trip to the underworld. Here, the physical symbolism of descent is meant to clue the reader into what's going on thematically inside the hero's head. Anyway, here the hero has to face and overcome their inner demons, and they emerge as a stronger and better person for it. Now, to be clear, the hero doesn't need to be in any physical danger for this portion of the story to be effective, and it can even be more effective when the danger is explicitly coming from inside the hero instead. It's essentially the mental, internal climax of the story, and it prepares the hero for the trials to come. Sometimes this is phrased as rebirth, since the hero is different when they emerge from the whale, but I personally find that this implies too much of a physical component, which just gets confusing. The key purpose of this stage is that the hero undergoes character development. In any case, this is a major turning point in the hero's journey, and usually marks the point where the hero is fully committed to the adventure and prepared for the dangers ahead. Stage 7 is the Road of Trials, the path out of the belly of the whale. Usually this part coincides with the appearance of a lot of tests, allies, and enemies. This usually includes a temptation to leave your quest test where the hero is tempted to abandon their journey. Campbell's version calls this the woman as temptress and gives it an entire section, but since that notion is more than a little antiquated, most people agree that any form of temptation, be it money, power, lust, or even just a good night's sleep, will do the trick. The Road of Trials is also frequently a large part of the story because, again, it's fun, and it's also really cool because since the hero has escaped the abyss, you get to see your hero as a full hero with their act together now. Stages 5 through 7 can be seen as one contiguous act since it's usually quite long and makes up most of the meat of the actual adventuring. Your hero's having wacky trials in Adventureland. What more do you need? The next stage is the
That's usually, if we just do stereotypical 3-act structure, right? Act 1 would end with the character going on the journey. Act 2 is that point where it is the adventure, abyss, and then the trials or whatever. And then Act 3 is the climax and falling action.
the pre-showdown breather, where you're coming up on the final confrontation against the physical or metaphorical big bad, so your hero or heroes take a quiet moment to reminisce. This one is also optional because sometimes you just straight up don't get that minute to breathe. Such is life. This gives your writer the chance to show off the humanity of the characters involved, which actually exposes some of the difficulties caused by the hero's journey, since ideally you don't need a designated chapter to remind your readers that these characters are fully developed characters. Usually you want that to be on full display for most of the story, but the hero's journey is a plot-driven structure which can easily supersede the unique characterization of the characters involved. The next stage is the climax of the story, and it can come in at least one of 3 flavors: the final showdown, the apotheosis, and the ultimate boon. And most stories will just put 2 or more of these together in some capacity because that just gives you more options. The most standard version of this is the final showdown, where the hero fights an overwhelmingly powerful enemy and the hero then defeats the big bad, frequently through some form of self-sacrifice. In the apotheosis, which is Greek for the elevation to godhood, the hero comes to view the world in a radically different way due to some revelation or received knowledge. Either that or they get a new power. Finally, there's the ultimate boon, where the hero attains their final reward which they've been seeking all along. Sometimes there's a final temptation to overcome first, but again, optional. In a lot of our media today, the climax to an adventure story almost always includes some big fight, but there are a lot more ways to go about writing a narrative climax that get brushed aside because, honestly, they're just more difficult and people are lazy. But their rarity makes reading a good non-fight climax more rewarding. What kind of climax your story ultimately has depends in large part on what kind of story you're trying to tell and what you want the reader to see as valuable. Whether that's a heightened knowledge of the world, victory over the forces of evil, or some gift that will make the ordinary world a better place is all up to you.
Yes, so this is something I say in a lot of these trope talks. Know the goal of what you want to say. Right? Know what you want to say with your story. Stories, I personally believe, persist beyond time when they are stories that have a purpose, when they are trying to convey something, speak to something. Um, that is what will make them stick. Have weight, have juice, meat, meat on the bone. So yeah, lean into what essentially you are trying to get across inside of your narrative, what matters to you, because also focusing on what matters to you as the author, as the writer, as a person is what will essentially differentiate your writing from other people. Focusing on what matters to you and the lived experience that you have. This is like the most important part, I think, about being a writer, in my opinion. Focusing on all of that, focusing on what matters to you and the things you have experienced in life, um, that is what will give you your authorial voice. That is what will differentiate you from the people that you have read. When you are first writing stories, you are going to be essentially copying, and your authorial voice is going to sound like a cheap imitation of your favorite authors. When my first story reads like a cheap imitation of A Song of Ice and Fire, because A Song of Ice and Fire is what finally gave me the motivation and push to try and write a story myself. And it is one of my favorites. I don't know if it's probably not going to be my top 5. Um, but it is still holds a special place in my heart because of that motivation it gave me. And because of that, right, there are things within my my first story is just very much reads like a cheap imitation, me trying to copy George R. R. Martin's authorial voice. Right, but now as I've grown as an author, I've read more, but I am also leaning heavier into, I have come to realize what exactly I want to tell in my stories. My authorial voice has become, I think, more unique. Is it quite there? Probably not. I haven't written that many stories. I've written 5 full novels. I've started like 8 novels. Only 5 been complete. From only 3 of those 5 I have edited to proper completion. Right? So yeah, I'm working on editing. I'm editing through my most current book that I've written, but then I'm hoping it'll be the one that actually gets me published. um, but yeah, it's focus heavily on what is important to you in your writing, and that is what will make your writing stand out from the group. Because your lived experience and what you find important, the different things you find important, are what combined are what essentially will make your story unique and different. It's not something you really have to try for. You just have to think about, all right, what things do I find important? Boom. Not a hard thing to really figure out.
After the
That's
climax, we get
intrinsic to
stages
you,
10 through 12,
who
which
you
all
are as a
happen in
person.
fairly quick succession. The first of which is the return, where the hero's all done with the adventure and needs to start heading home. This can be a high-octane chase or a slow, sedate, and contemplative journey back. Next, the hero crosses the return threshold and makes it back into the ordinary world. Lastly, there's the final reward, the hero's happy ending. Here, the hero is back in the ordinary world, and not only is the hero a better and stronger person for their journey, but the world itself has usually been improved in some way as well. This sometimes gets coded as the hero returning with an elixir, which is of course taken directly from the medicine journey, where this is the part where the protagonists return to the world with the solution to the problem that sent them on the journey in the first place. So that's pretty much the hero's journey, and while I doubt there are too many stories that tick all the checkboxes, I'm sure you recognized a few of these stages from at least a handful of stories. It's not a one-size-fits-all guide to how to write the perfect story, because if you wrote a story that exactly follows this, it would feel ridiculously generic, but there are a lot of useful components to be found here if we look at the stages in isolation. For example, the ordinary world is super useful because it establishes a comfortable status quo that your audience and hero will want to return to. When that world is threatened, you can discuss the visceral discomfort of a disrupted status quo, and a story that takes place in that zone of discomfort will be by necessity uncomfortable for your audience, who will be waiting with bated breath for things to be fixed. Also, because you establish it as comfortable and familiar for your hero, your audience will potentially empathize with this and feel similarly driven to protect it when it comes under fire. The refusal of the call is useful because it addresses the fact that most adventure is dangerous and scary. See, most real-life endeavors or adventures like activism, public performance, or just anything where it feels like there's stuff to lose are frequently undesirable until and unless they become highly personal to the active party. So the feeling of being pulled between the desire to do the right thing and the fear of the possible consequences is relatable for most of your audience. Overall, this stage establishes that your character isn't just a vehicle for the plot and isn't necessarily a willing participant in your story. But note that this stage isn't always necessary and can sometimes feel like a disingenuous token protest, and oh, I couldn't possibly from the hero before the plot really gets going. The Realm of Adventure has one major thing going for it. It's different. That's a very useful starting point, and because you establish that your hero starts in a familiar, ordinary world, you can show off this new, fancy world to your audience as much as you like, since they'll be just as clueless about it as your heroes will be. You can display your world building for all to see, which is convenient if you're an especially enthusiastic world builder. This works as a contrast with the ordinary world, and can't function without it, since without the ordinary world, the Realm of Adventure is just a world. Establishing its difference from the norm lets you explore it fully without this feeling like a contrived info dump. The Belly of the Whale is interesting because challenging your heroes is good. Doing that physically is fine, but challenging them mentally is frequently more interesting, usually because it has a more uncertain outcome. From a meta perspective,
Okay, so when it comes to the mental challenge and the physical challenge, I feel like it depends on what kind of story you're telling in the sense of what medium you are using. If you are using uh, a written medium, book medium of books and novels, it is much easier to convey a mental challenge instead of a physical challenge, right? We are inside the mind of these characters throughout the entire novel. It is much easier to convey that. It is harder to convey that in a visual medium such as television and movies because it comes across as clunkier if we are really kind of inside the mind of character, right? There are different ways you have to handle it, which is tends to be why the physical challenge is a lot more um, showcased in television and movies. Video games are the one medium that I think get the pass in which they can do both. Just because of the way we can suspend our disbelief with video games. They allow us to both get inside the mind of the character, but also be that visual medium and benefit from also the things that movies and television benefit from. Video games literally can have the best of both worlds, of the best of books, best aspects of books, and the best aspects of movies and television and combine them. Kind of a shame that more games don't take advantage of that, but it is what it is.
Most heroes can't really afford to lose a physical fight if death is a possible outcome, but your heroes can absolutely fail a mental trial. The only consequence is their mental health and well-being. That means angst, as well as tons of opportunities for character development. Your hero emerges from the belly of the whale when they finally succeeded in their mental task, but this doesn't necessarily have to be easy or quick, and they can even have adventures while still super messed up. Sometimes the belly of the whale is more of a state of mind than it is a physical location. The pre-showdown banter lets your heroes chill a bit, which is good because we always have to remember that these characters are human. Again, it's easy to get caught up in the story you want to tell and the adventure you want to write, but if it's non-stop action, your characters and your audience will get exhausted. Pacing is super important. Let your heroes take a minute to recuperate, let your audience hit the bathrooms or take a nap or something. All emphasis is no emphasis. The high-octane adventure loses its impact if you never have the slow, subtle stages. It also doesn't really have to happen right before the big showdown. Breathers can honestly happen anywhere. This whole thing is more of a structural reminder that pacing really matters. For the return/final reward, your adventure ends eventually, and while not all stories end back where they started, there's a melancholic victory in doing it that way. Your hero's home, but is it home anymore? Consider the ending of Lord of the Rings. They return to the Shire, but they can never go back to who they were before the adventure. For Merry and Pippin, this is good. They're stronger, taller, more badass. For Sam, he's braver and can probably get his reward of raising a family, but for Frodo, the Shire can never be his home again. He can only get the rest he deserves by leaving Middle-earth entirely, because you can't always go home again. It's a good way to give the story a bittersweet ending, as well as explore what an ending should be like. Also,
hold on, guys, I'm sorry. I just have to think about how perfect Lord of the Rings is. Now, here's the thing. I've complained before about I think Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring as a book is a slog to get through, but Return of the Two Towers and Return of the King, when you look at it as a whole, right, even though it is a slog, the slog becomes worth it at the end. It's just, right, like, that slog is so painful to get through. I'm sorry, the chapter where Gandalf essentially just narrates and tells a story, lore dumps at Rivendell at the Council of Elrond, is like the worst chapter in the entire book. I hated that chapter so much. It took me days just to read that chapter because it's just not an engaging chapter. But the ending to Lord of the Rings is literally a masterpiece ending.
does their story even need to end? Maybe this is only the first of many adventures. Maybe even though they've finished the adventure, they now know that they can't just sit idly by when stuff goes wrong. Maybe when they return, the adventure continues. The end doesn't have to be the end. And as something extra to think about, the hero is a vague archetype, but it still has fairly rigid components, when really the hero of this story can be almost anyone. Campbell implies a strict hero character, but really the only trait that the hero needs in this structure is that they're usually naive when it comes to the unfamiliar world, which is reasonable. Look no further than Red's other trope talks to see much, much more about how you can really play with a hero character. So, there's really nothing wrong with this trope intrinsically, as it helps us understand a multitude of excellent stories from all over the world, but it shouldn't guide your writing on its own. It's similar to the rule of three in that it's more of a recurring concept than a trope people deliberately invoke. But in another similar vein to the rule of three, people tend to think it's more structurally vital than it really needs to be. You can write an excellent hero story without needing to use the hero's journey model. Just look at Captain America, which has exactly 0 elements of the classic hero's journey. Tellingly, most modern versions of this model explicitly state that any number of component parts can and usually are excluded from the final product. Which is great, because with this generator that we hooked up to Campbell's grave, we can power the entire eastern seaboard with how fast he's spinning. Ultimately, it's good to be aware of it, and there's a lot of useful stuff included in it. Plus, once you know how to look for it, much like the rule of three, it is everywhere. But it doesn't dictate how you have to write, and it's nowhere near universal. So don't do anything for the sake of just doing it. Do it if it helps you tell your story. Whoa!
Dude, you would not believe the afternoon I just had.
Where have you been? I just did a whole... Never mind. What is that?
An elixir, I think. Seemed important that I return with it.
Huh.
Also, did you know this bookcase has been a foot away from the wall the whole time? So, yeah.
Okay. And that was Trope Talk, the hero's journey. Thought I'd have more to say in this, and I turned out not to. It's always the ones you think you'll have a lot to say that you don't, and then the ones you don't think you'll have a lot to say, you will. Trope Talk Robots being an example. I had more to say, but I cut myself off because I was fucking hungry. So yeah. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.